With me is the MD for Brand Finance Africa, my good friend Jeremy Sampson. Always has lots to say around the field of branding and marketing. Jeremy, good talking to you once again.
Ashraf, always good to you. And let's get it out there. Happy birthday.
Well, there
today.
you are. I expected you to say a thing like that. Let's talk about other anniversaries of sorts from a whole lot of brands in terms of where they are. Now your organization, the Brand Finance, puts out a series of reports, right? Quite a few throughout the year. There's been a few that you put out recently. Tell me about, let's talk about them firstly. Which one you want to talk about? Cosmetics, I understand, and hotels in particular.
That's right. Just to take a step back, Brand Finance is a PLC. It's based in London, in the City of London. It's been around 25 years or so. It was a breakaway from my old company into brand Sampson. And Brand Finance today is in about 20 countries. But as you say, one of the things they do from the end of January is start produce rankings of the top brands in the world. 2 days later, the top banks in the world. And so it's a whole series of rankings that runs right through until about September of categories, segments, and countries, comparing nation brands. You say, just in the last 10 days, one has come out on cosmetics. A couple of weeks ago, one was on apparel, and Nike was the top brand there. Cosmetics, L'Oreal is the top brand. So we have a stream of them coming out. And we're hoping to put out our rankings of the top South African brands, which we'll be doing with Brand South Africa, as we've done for the last few years. And we're hoping that will happen on July the 8th. Obviously, at the moment, with the impact of COVID-19, everything is a bit of a movable feast. For the most part, that's our plan. So we'll be coming out with South Africa's top 50 yet again.
Okay, and these rankings, two things there. A, how much currency do these rankings have? And B, you can tell me about how you go about getting the rankings right in the first place, the formula.
Right, good question. Well, the first thing is that there is an international standards, and the ISO issues standards for both brand valuation, that's the financial value of a brand, and the brand equity, that's more the brand. And in fact, a new ISO on the equity side. Brand value, the ISO has been out for some years, and Brand Finance is one of only a handful of companies that complies with that. So when we put out a value, it's ISO accredited. Everything is signed off in London by the top team there. And basically, when people look at the value of a brand, you can see who's moving up, who's moving down, what are the trends, what are the impacts in certain regions or countries. And obviously COVID-19, since the end of January, has had more impact on some categories than others. And it's very interesting how COVID has, as we know, decimated airlines, decimated hotels and tourism generally. But then there are some sectors, of which cosmetics is one, apparel is another, that have kept going reasonably strongly. And it's going to be very interesting to see how they go. Obviously, the tech brands like Amazon has done incredibly well because of all of its deliveries and because it's tech-based. And that's where we're finding generally that tech-based brands are doing incredibly well. It's interesting that, Ashraf, about a year ago, if we talked about top brands, we'd have probably never mentioned Zoom. And Zoom has come to us. Here we are talking on Skype, but we could be on Team or Zoom or even FaceTime. There are so many different things. And I think it's almost one of the hottest shares, is it the New York Stock Exchange or wherever it's ranked, that Zoom has gone up through the roof because it's just so potent and so relevant today. And I think, as we're saying, the world is changing. The world has changed, but it'll be different tonight from it is this morning. And one of the things is we're doing all these things technically and talking to each other technically and face-to-face. So who needs to have a face-to-face meeting anymore? It'd be nice to have a cup of coffee, but that's the past almost. And
we certainly do miss that, and hopefully that will come up pretty soon, right? So, okay, let's talk about the hotel industry then. In terms of the shifts that have happened as per your latest, scoreboard, right? Run through that.
I haven't got the scores in front of me, but it's people are the ones that are the strongest, and they have so many sub-brands sometimes as well, so they cater for different segments of the population. Sometimes, of course, those major brands have acquired other brands in different geographies, and they don't always rebadge themselves as, shall we say, a Marriott or a Hilton, but they have been really decimated, and I know that a lot of them are having huge difficulties. There's a lot of talk about how many of them will survive. And of course, it's a very complicated industry, because when, for instance, you see the chief executive of Marriott, who has been taking a huge leadership role, and I have to say, watching him on Twitter and YouTube, he's taken a fantastic role, but it's very noticeable that he doesn't look a healthy man. And it transpires that he's just been through, as you're nodding away, you obviously know, a cancer scare, and but he's still there, and he's still in charge, and he's showing huge leadership. But he explains that sometimes, for instance, the properties that hotels are housed in are not owned by the hotel. So the risk factor isn't as great as it might be, and that risk is spread amongst the different stakeholders, if I can call them that, from the property owners to the license holders and then to the management teams. So it's a very complex area, but I think the bigger boys will survive, obviously. I know in South Africa there's a lot of talk about City Lodge. Will it have deep enough pockets to survive at the moment? And I think a lot of people hope so, because I know people who stay at it rave about it. But that's, I'm afraid, one of the unintended consequences of the times we live in, that despite being well revered and well regarded, simply put,
And are
they
there
will not
brands
survive.
in the hotel space, where the overall space has plummeted? We understand that, but are there brands that incredibly appear to have bucked the trend? Is there something like that?
I don't think there is a single example of that, because hotels, when you think about it, is it tourism? Well, tourism has virtually stopped. Is it conferences? Conferences have definitely stopped. Is it gambling? And that, for the most part, has stopped. I seem to recall reading about 10 days ago that in Macau, and of course Macau is the biggest gambling center of the world, much bigger than Las Vegas, Macau has started gambling again. But sporting events, for instance, a lot of hotels, certainly in the UK, are linked to sporting arenas, as I think is at Manchester United or Manchester City's ground, and obviously positioned there to take advantage of sport. So all these things basically have stopped. Most hotels are only housing sometimes frontline workers or hospital workers. I know in New York City, that's what some of the hotels are doing. They're looking after people in the front line who are away from home and need local accommodation. And of course, there is no other local accommodation. There's no Airbnb, there are no guest houses. So some of those biggest hotels are using sections to look after people in need at the moment.
Okay, well, and let's talk cosmetics then. Let's talk about the cosmetic industry.
Cosmetics is one of those sectors that's actually still doing very well. Whether you use hand cream or shampoo, and we used to say the ladies use their fragrances, but I know a lot of guys use their fragrances and deodorants and things now as well. So that goes on, and these are fairly small ticket items. They're not that expensive, and whether you have them delivered over the last couple of months or now you can go out to a Clicks or a Discount and buy them. So those brands are carrying on. The big, strongest brand is L'Oreal, the French brand, which is by far the biggest. But it's then interesting when you look at Gillette, and people are joking, how's Gillette doing at the moment? I notice you're shaving, but in my case, I'm not shaving, and a lot of people aren't shaving, so perhaps Gillette's figures are going down a bit. And then Nivea is the third brand, and Nivea a lot of people don't realize, if I said to you, which country does Nivea come from? A lot of people don't realize it's actually German. So you have L'Oreal French, Gillette, which is part of Procter & Gamble now, American, and Nivea is in third place. Interesting as an aside as well that a lot of people forget that the Body Shop, which of course Anita Roddick started years ago, and a lot of people still regard very highly because of its ethical approach to life. And as an aside, people might not remember that a former chief executive, and I'm trying to recall his name, who worked at Edgar's, became the chief executive of, in fact, the Body Shop for a time. But then L'Oreal bought the Body Shop some years ago. But then L'Oreal had a bit of a scandal because it was found that they still used animals for testing of various things. And that didn't fit very well with, obviously, the Body Shop when it became public domain. So the Body Shop was sold in about 2017 by L'Oreal to a group called Natura. And I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but I certainly hadn't. And in fact, it's from Brazil.
Okay.
So Body Shop might be a surprise to a lot of people, but this is an example of a brand still carrying on, still being high regarded. After all, do you worry that a Jaguar is made by Tata today or a Land Rover? So in the case of Body Shop, which of course in South Africa is handled through the Clicks Group, it's actually ultimately owned by the Brazilians.
Well, now we know, isn't it? Yeah. I suppose it also says, in terms of the shifts you've just given, how COVID-19 has impacted on restraining certain industries, but also provide the catalyst for others. I think the issue around cleanliness is uppermost amongst that, and therefore a spike for the right reasons in those industries. Let's then talk very quickly about brands that seem, in terms of their brand communication, they've got it spot on in embracing the realities of COVID-19 and other ethical issues in the last few weeks.
I think in South Africa, I have to scratch my head to think, and I don't know if you have any thoughts, but in South Africa, I haven't seen anyone taking a really strong stand. Whereas in the States, I think some companies like Starbucks have deliberately played a role. People have publicly talked about senior executives taking pay cuts. I know in South Africa that Pick n Pay has done that. Some of them have, they're working below the radar, if I can call it that. They don't want to shout it from the houses. I find it very interesting how we've had COVID-19, but if you're watching international television today, it's all about racism and about the riots. And it's really absolutely terrible what we're seeing from the incident last week, which, let's face it, was, whether it's homicide 1, 2, or 3, it was plain murder. And then you see a brand like Nike gently putting out a television ad, which Wieden and King did last, Thursday or so, saying, just don't do it. And to me, that is very, very powerful. It's even more powerful when you hear that the arch enemy of Nike, Adidas, actually restreamed the ad as well in sympathy with the whole thing.
Wow.
And this to me is very, very powerful, where here is a brand that has got its finger totally on the pulse, is reacting quickly, and it's an example of an agile brand. We all know that today brands must be agile, they must be quick, they must respond, and that some of them are not. But in the case of Nike, it was spot on, and I think this is an example to all other great brands that you've got to keep your eyes wide open, finger on the pulse, and react quickly. But then you've got to get it right. You don't want to do like H&M did a little while ago and got it totally wrong. So again, as you and I know, sometimes you can do things and get them wrong. And then it would be better, in fact, if you've done nothing at all.
Well, here's the question then. So we understand the stance, the global stance against racism is a given, and Nike has done that. But are there inherent risks when a brand, in this case, yes, does embrace a global phenomenon? So they're not being selective, but are there risks attached to that? Considering that many people who may well be their market may not like the type of stance they take, and they could actually even be racist as well. We just don't know, isn't it?
you broke up a little bit there, but the answer is that in any advertising you do, you've got to be incredibly sensitive. No, it still amazes me today that you see people have put out ads which they've quickly had to withdraw. Now, I know it's one of the tactics of some ad agencies to put out things on a Friday night, knowing full well they'd have to withdraw it by Sunday and say, oh, sorry. But we see other people who have actually put out ads seriously thinking that these will hit the mark and make the point that they want to make, but there's such a strong reaction against them for whatever reason. It might be racial, it might be environmental or whatever. And of course, everyone has to be very aware that today, especially with social media, and especially with that you can get someone who's taking a lot of flack at the moment is Facebook, for various reasons. But Facebook is under attack from all sorts of quarters, not just one or two. They're sometimes streaming things in one country which offends the culture or the religion of that country. Sometimes putting out things which just they're not in any censoring some of the tweets that Trump is putting out, President Trump, whereas Twitter is. And Nike is being accused by a lot of people of being unethical. They're even having senior members of staff resigning because they don't want to work for a company anymore that they regard as unethical. And a lot of people think that, for instance, President Trump, through his tweets, has been, well, to be polite, insensitive, but no, rather almost inciting violence, inciting the country, states.
So
that's where I find it interesting watching. Go on.
So here's the point: whether it's Nike or whether it's the Facebooks or the Twitters and everybody else that we speak about, apparel or even in the communication space, should these brands then should they take sides? Because Nike's done just that, isn't it? Very clearly.
Nike has done that. Nike takes a stand. Nike is never grey. It makes a stand specifically. I'm trying to remember the baseball player who kneeled when the American anthem. Yes, and at the time there was a lot of controversy, not only about him but about Nike. And Nike, basically says we will do what we think is right, and sometimes almost to hell with the consequences. And that's where I think they become seen as, one of their values is to be authentic, and I think they always are authentic. And you could add to that brave as well. But as a result of that, I think they're highly regarded. You know exactly where they stand. They're not sort of sticking their head down underneath the parapet, as it were. They're proudly standing there and they're making their mark. And to say, just don't do it, is incredibly powerful.
Okay, and that's where we're going to leave it. They've just done it, and the message is very, very clear. Jeremy, good chatting to you. I'm going to, well, thanks as always, right? And hopefully we'll have lots more chats down the line, I know that. But thanks for your time, Jeremy.